Welcome. You've gathered a really fascinating set of sources on ancient Israel. And our job today is to pull out those key insights, those aha moments, without getting totally lost in the weeds.
Exactly. Today, we're diving into the history of ancient Israel. We'll be looking at historical assessments from, well, within the Old Testament itself. You know, the prophets, the Deuteronomistic
Yeah,
history.
Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, right?
Right. Those books offering that theological take, often focusing on covenant faithfulness, and then Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. But we'll also bring in archaeological finds and other ancient texts where they shed light. And of course, the whole idea of covenant is central.
Yeah, and you see in the prophets, they're constantly evaluating things, aren't they? Seeing events as leading either to, well, good outcomes or disaster.
Definitely. And running alongside that, there's always this thread of hope, this eschatological hope, the belief that God will ultimately redeem his people despite everything.
So we'll look at how the Old Testament itself presents its history. It's not just one style, is it?
Not at all. You've got different kinds of historical writing. Some parts are more straightforward narrative, others are reflective, and then you have these big covenant speeches.
And we'll also touch on how archaeology and other texts from the ancient Near East kind of intersect, sometimes confirming things, sometimes leaving us, well, uncertain.
Precisely. We need to see where there's corroboration and where we just have to say we can't be completely sure.
Okay, so let's dive in. When we talk about history, it's not just about digging stuff up out of the ground, is it?
No, that's a great starting point. What's interesting is the difference between artifacts and texts. Think about artifacts, pottery, tools, foundations. They're like brute facts. They exist, sure, but they don't tell their own story.
Right, like a broken pot doesn't have a label saying, held wine for King David.
Exactly. Even inscriptions, actual writing on stone or clay, need interpretation. You have to ask, who made this, how, and crucially, why?
So the Old Testament texts themselves become super important because they're offering an internal interpretation of Israel's own history.
That's the key. The Old Testament gives us this internal assessment from different angles. You've got the prophets commenting in real time, so to speak. Then the historical books, Deuteronomistic history, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, they're looking back, reflecting on that history from a later point.
And it's definitely not just a neutral, objective report. There's a strong sense that these writers saw events leading towards prosperity or towards downfall based on faithfulness.
Absolutely. That prophetic evaluation is central. But woven into that is always this theme of hope. Even amidst judgment and failure, there's this persistent belief that God's plan for Israel will ultimately succeed, that redemption is coming.
Okay, let's turn to Deuteronomy. It's obviously a hugely important book, but you've mentioned it's maybe the least overtly historiographical of the first five books. Why is that?
Well, if you look at its structure, its literary form, Deuteronomy is essentially framed as Moses' farewell address. It's like one massive covenant text given just before they enter Canaan. It looks a lot like other ancient Near Eastern covenant or treaty documents.
Ah, okay. So it's laying out the terms of the relationship, the agreement between God and Israel.
Exactly. Its main job was to repeat and clarify the core covenant message they first received back in Exodus chapters 20 to 23. Remember, the generation that actually stood at Sinai had mostly died off during those 40 years wandering.
Right.
So this new generation needed to hear it again to understand their obligations under the covenant.
That wasn't unusual for the time, reaffirming treaties and things.
No, not at all. It was actually pretty standard practice across the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. When a new generation came up among a vassal people, you'd often have a ceremony to reaffirm the covenant terms with the ruling power. Plus, think about the original Sinai covenant. It was given to people living a nomadic life.
In the desert, yeah.
Right. Now they were about to settle down, become farmers, live in towns. Life was changing, so the covenant needed some, let's say, adjustments and clarifications for that new sedentary lifestyle.
So Deuteronomy is Moses basically saying, okay, people, remember who you are, where you came from, and what your purpose is as you go into this new land.
Precisely. It's reminding them of their identity, their rescue from Egypt, and their unique mission as God's people. This idea of being a sort of mediator among the nations, like it says in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Let me find it on here. Here. See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.
That's powerful. Okay, let's jump back a bit chronologically to the patriarchs. The term Hebrew pops up. It seems like maybe that wasn't their favorite name for themselves initially.
That's a really interesting point. The very first time we see the word Hebrew used in the Old Testament, in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13, it's actually a non-Israelite using it, and that hints at something broader. The chosen people themselves didn't often use that term, especially early on.
Why not? What was the issue?
Well, the term Hebrew probably comes from Eber, who was an ancestor of Abram that's mentioned back in Genesis chapter 10, verses 21 and 25. But the name sounded a lot like another term floating around then, Apiru, or sometimes Ebibiru.
And who were they?
The Apiru were sort of a social class, often rootless people, mercenaries, sometimes refugees, found across the ancient Near East. They weren't a single ethnic group. So while Abram and his descendants knew they were distinct, outsiders might have confused them or, frankly, used Hebrew almost as an insult, lumping them in with the Apiru.
Ah, so it carried some negative baggage, possibly.
It seems likely. So while others might have called them Hebrews, they increasingly preferred to identify themselves by their covenant relationship with God, eventually settling on Israelites as their primary self-designation, especially once they became a nation.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's a dramatic one. The biblical timeline puts their destruction around, what, 2067 BC, based on Isaac's birth? Is there any external evidence that points towards that?
It's tricky. Dating ancient events precisely is always a challenge. But intriguingly, the Ebla tablets, inscriptions found in Syria dating from maybe 2500 BC or a bit later, do seem to mention cities that sound very much like Sodom and Gomorrah. That at least puts names like those on the map in that general era.
And what about archaeology?
Well, excavations down near the Dead Sea, particularly at a site called Bab Edra and some others nearby, have found the ruins of several ancient towns. The interesting thing is that the latest occupation layers at these sites seem to end sometime before 2000 BC.
Hmm. So the timing lines up reasonably well with the biblical time frame.
It does. The locations also fit the description of the cities of the plain. Now, can we definitively point to one ruin and say, that's Sodom? No, not without some kind of inscription found at the site confirming it. But the circumstantial evidence, the location, the time frame of destruction, it's certainly compatible and offers, let's say, plausible corroboration for the biblical account.
Okay. And the story of Joseph in Egypt. Another major narrative. You mentioned some scholars see it more as wisdom literature, but the Old Testament itself treats it as history.
Yes, within the flow of Genesis, the Joseph story is presented as part of the historical narrative leading up to the Exodus. While it definitely has wisdom themes, providence, dealing with adversity, its placements and detail suggest the biblical writers understood it as describing real events.
There's also that debate about when Joseph might have been in Egypt. Some link him to the Hyksos period.
Right. The Hyksos were foreign rulers of Semitic origin who controlled parts of Egypt from about 1661 to 1570 BC. The argument goes that maybe a Hyksos pharaoh would be more likely to promote another Semite like Joseph to such a high position.
Makes a certain kind of sense.
It does on the surface. But that theory often depends on accepting a shorter period for the Israelites' stay in Egypt, like 215 years, instead of the traditional 430 and a much later date for the Exodus. Neither of those points holds up particularly well under closer examination of all the evidence.
So, based on the chronology we're generally following.
Based on that, Joseph would have been born around 1916 BC, entered Egypt around 1899 BC, and risen to prominence after that. This timeline places him well before the Hyksos, suggesting he served a native Egyptian pharaoh during the Middle Kingdom period, which actually fits many of the details in the Genesis account quite well.
Okay, let's move forward to the Exodus itself. Before leading the people out, Moses spends a long time in Midian. He fled there around 1486 BC.
That's the timeline, yes. 40 years old when he fled Egypt after killing the Egyptian. He found refuge in Midian, which was likely in the northwestern Arabian Peninsula, across the Gulf of Aqaba from Sinai. And interestingly, the Midianites were themselves descendants of Abraham through his later wife Keturah, as Genesis 25 verse 2 tells us.
And that's where he meets his wife, Zipporah, and her father, Jethro.
Exactly. He connects with Jethro, who's also called Reuel in some places. He's a Midianite priest, but significantly, Exodus 18 verse 11 tells us Jethro also came to worship Yahweh, Israel's God. Moses marries Jethro's daughter, Zipporah, and they have two sons, Gershom and Eleazar. It's near the end of those 40 years in Midian that God appears to Moses in the burning bush at Mount Sinai and commissions him for the Exodus.
Right. Now, after the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, they enter Canaan. The formation of the 12-tribe confederacy seems like a key step. By about 1200 BC, it looks like there was a recognizable entity called Israel.
Yes, the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5 is a very early piece of Hebrew poetry, and it definitely depicts a functioning coalition of tribes, probably by 1200 BC at the latest. How exactly that confederacy came together is a point of scholarly discussion.
The names Noth and Bright often come up here, right? Different theories.
They do. Martin Noth, a German scholar, argued that the tribes perhaps came together for other reasons, maybe political or social, and then developed a shared religious faith based around a central sanctuary, probably Shechem initially. John Bright, an American scholar, argued the other way around, that it was shared faith in Yahweh stemming from the Exodus experience that drew these disparate groups together into a confederacy.
But both agree that traditions got mingled.
Yes, that's a key point of agreement. Regardless of how they came together, once they formed this league, their individual histories and traditions started to merge, becoming the shared heritage of all Israel. This suggests that the neat picture of 12 tribes descending directly from 12 sons of Jacob might be a later theological structuring reflecting the unity achieved, rather than a precise historical account of origins for every single group that became part of Israel.
Interesting. Okay, so after the initial settlement under Joshua, we enter the period of the Judges. Things seem to go downhill pretty quickly, with this first widespread apostasy leading to an invasion by Cushan Rishathaim. That's a mouthful.
It is. Kusan Rishathaim of Aram Naharam. Aram Naharam means Aram of the two rivers, probably referring to a region up near the Euphrates in Syria or Mesopotamia. Some link him to figures mentioned in Egyptian texts like Cushan Ram or the land of Narin. The Rishathaim part likely isn't his actual name, but an insult added by the Israelites, meaning something like double wickedness.
Ouch. Okay, and Othniel was the judge who saved them.
Yes, Othniel, Caleb's nephew, is the first judge mentioned who delivered Israel from this oppression, dated roughly around 1350 BC. The pattern in Judges is set early. Israel turns from Yahweh, faces oppression, cries out, God raises a deliverer, there's peace, and then the cycle repeats. Judges chapter 2, verse 17 describes this turning away as whoring after other gods.
Samson is probably one of the most famous judges, but also one whose stories seem larger than life. Do scholars view him as historical?
Well, critical scholarship often questions the historicity of the Samson narratives because of the superhuman feats, tearing a lion apart, killing Philistines with a donkey's jawbone. But even if one debates the literalness of every detail, the stories serve a clear purpose in the book. They vividly illustrate the ongoing, intense conflict between the Israelites, particularly the tribe of Dan, and the encroaching Philistines. His strength, tied to his Nazirite vow symbolized by his uncut hair, represented Yahweh's power when he was faithful.
And the Philistines were major players then. What do we know about them? Their origins, their religion?
Their origins are still debated, but many signs point towards the ancient world, maybe Crete or Mycenaean Greece. They were part of the Sea Peoples migrations around the 12th century BC. Their language likely had ancient roots, though we don't have enough texts to be certain. Religiously, they seem to have adopted and adapted local Canaanite gods alongside whatever they brought with them.
A syncretism.
Exactly, a blending. Their chief god seems to have been Dagon, often depicted as a grain god, but 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 4 describes the idol falling and breaking in a way that some interpret as suggesting a half-human, half-fish form, maybe reflecting their maritime origins adapting to life in agricultural Canaan. They also worship deities like Baal-zebub and Ashtoreth, familiar from Canaanite religion.
And this conflict wasn't just with Samson, it went back earlier.
Oh yes, the Philistine pressure was a long-term issue. Shamgar, listed as the third judge, is noted for fighting them even before Samson's time.
Okay, so that context of instability and external threats helps explain the next big shift, the move towards monarchy. The people actually demanded a king.
They did. 1 Samuel chapter 8 describes the elders coming to Samuel and saying, basically, give us a king to lead us like all the other nations. It seems the decentralized system of judges felt inadequate, especially facing organized threats like the Philistines. They wanted stronger, more consistent leadership.
But it wasn't just about having a general, was it? The Israelite idea of kingship was different.
It was meant to be. Ideally, the king wasn't just a political or military leader. He was also supposed to be the chief upholder of the covenant, responsible for leading the people in faithfulness to Yahweh. It was a dual role.
Saul was the first one chosen, around 1050 BC,
Mm.
but things didn't go smoothly for him.
No. Saul was chosen in response to the people's demand, but his reign was marked by disobedience, particularly instances where he overstepped his bounds or directly disobeyed God's commands through Samuel. This led to that famous moment in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, where Samuel tells him God has sought out a man after his own heart to replace him.
And that man was David, his anointing by Samuel, and then that famous encounter with Goliath.
David's secret anointing by Samuel in 1 Samuel 16, verse 13, marks the divine shift. And yes, the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17, down in the valley of Elah near Philistine Gath, became this iconic demonstration not just of David's courage, but of his faith that Yahweh would deliver Israel.
We also see moments of desperation, like when he's on the run from Saul and goes to Nob.
Right. His visit to the priest Ahimelech at Nob, described in 1 Samuel 21. He gets the consecrated showbread to eat and takes Goliath's sword. It shows how precarious his situation was, relying on quick thinking and, well, perhaps some stretching of the rules out of necessity, while still operating under God's protection.
He even ended up seeking refuge with the Philistines for a while, didn't he? That seems ironic.
It does. He spent about 10 years as an outlaw, and for part of that time, he and his band of followers took refuge with Achish, the Philistine king of Gath. 1 Samuel 27 tells that story. It was a complex political maneuver, playing both sides to survive.
So after Saul's death, David doesn't just immediately become king of everyone.
No, it was a process. First, the tribe of Judah recognized him as king in Hebron. He reigned there for 7.5 years. Only after that, and after more conflict and negotiation, did the northern tribes finally come and accept him as king over all Israel. That unification is described in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 to 5.
And David had a specific understanding of his own role, connecting it back to Melchizedek.
Yes, that's a fascinating aspect. David seems to have understood his kingship in Jerusalem, the old city of Melchizedek, as having a priestly dimension, echoing Melchizedek, who is both king of Salem and priest of God Most High, back in Genesis chapter 14. This helped justify bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and establishing it as the religious center, linking his royal authority with a kind of priestly legitimacy.
He also started building an administration around himself.
He did. Even during his outlaw years, that core group of 600 loyal men, mentioned in 1 Samuel 27, verse 2, formed the basis of his military. Abiathar, the priest who escaped the massacre at Nob, became his chaplain. Once king, Joab became his long-serving, though sometimes problematic, military commander.
Then comes Solomon, David's son, whose reign is often called the Golden Age, largely because of the temple.
Solomon's reign, roughly 970 to 930 BC, was certainly a period of relative peace, prosperity, and major building projects. The most famous, of course, was the temple in Jerusalem. It was a huge undertaking, taking 7 years, finally completed around 959 BC, according to 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 38.
And he didn't do it alone. He made alliances, like with Hiram of Tyre.
Absolutely. Diplomacy was key. His treaty with Hiram, king of Tyre, recorded in 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 12, was crucial. Tyre was a major maritime power with access to resources like timber from Lebanon and skilled artisans. Hiram provided materials and craftsmen, including a master craftsman also named Huram, or Huram-Abi, in exchange for agricultural products like wheat and olive oil from Israel.
Solomon's prayer at the temple's dedication is a really significant theological statement.
It really is. You find it in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 22 following. Solomon acknowledges God's faithfulness to the covenant made with his father, David, but he also stresses God's transcendence, that the temple can't contain God. Yet it's designated as this special place where God chooses to localize his name, a place where the people can pray, seek forgiveness, and experience restoration. See verses 27 through 53 for that whole section.
He also built a massive palace complex for himself, which took even longer than the temple.
Yes, that's often overlooked. After the temple, he spent 13 years building his royal palace complex, finishing around 946 BC, according to 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. It signaled the grandeur and perhaps the growing expenses of his reign.
And his political reach was pretty wide. Vassals, treaties.
His influence extended significantly. He seems to have controlled vassal states like Zobah and Hamath in Syria, parts of Arabia, maybe even Philistia. He also maintained parity treaties agreements between equals with major powers like Tyre and Egypt, often sealed through diplomatic marriages, as mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 10 to 14 and 26 to 28.
But despite all this success, his reign ended on a down note, with spiritual compromise setting in.
Sadly, yes. It seems to have been a gradual drift rather than a sudden collapse. His numerous political marriages brought foreign wives and, with them, their foreign gods and cultic practices into Jerusalem. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4 puts it starkly. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Those compromises ultimately paved the way for the kingdom's division.
Yeah, you really see the consequences of that drift playing out immediately after him. The kingdom splits.
Right after Solomon's death, around 930 BC, the tensions boiled over. The northern tribes rejected Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and made Jeroboam their king. So you end up with the northern kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam I, and the southern kingdom of Judah remaining loyal to the Davidic line under Rehoboam. 1 Kings chapter 12 gives the details.
And Jeroboam, to consolidate his power, set up rival worship centers, didn't he? With golden calves.
He did. That was a decisive and ultimately disastrous move. He established cultic centers at Bethel in the south of his kingdom and Dan in the far north, complete with golden calves. He appointed his own priests, not from the tribe of Levi, and even instituted a new festival calendar to compete with Jerusalem's. His words when dedicating the calves, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt," recorded in 1 Kings 12:28, deliberately echoed Aaron's infamous words back at Sinai during the original golden calf incident in Exodus 32, verse 4.
Wow, he was really positioning himself as an alternative religious authority?
Absolutely. He was essentially setting himself up as a rival priestly mediator, challenging the religious authority centered in Jerusalem and the Davidic dynasty.
Meanwhile, on the larger geopolitical stage, Assyria starts making moves westward.
Yes, around this time, the Neo-Assyrian Empire begins its resurgence. Kings like Adad-nirari II, ruling from 911 to 891 BC, started pushing west again. This gradually increased pressure on the smaller kingdoms in Syria and Palestine, including Israel and Judah. You see alliances forming, like the one between King Asa of Judah and Ben-Hadad of Damascus, likely partly driven by awareness of this growing Assyrian threat.
Back in the northern kingdom, Israel, the leadership changes, but the religious problems often continued, like with Baasha.
Right. Baasha seized the throne from Jeroboam's son, Nadab, but the biblical account says he continued the sinful practices Jeroboam had started. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, pronounced judgment on Baasha's house in 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 1 to 4, and it sounds very similar to the judgment pronounced earlier on Jeroboam's dynasty. It underscores this idea that while God allowed other dynasties to rule in Israel, their continuance was conditional on obedience, unlike the unconditional promise to David's line for the messianic hope.
And Egypt wasn't really in a position to help these smaller kingdoms against Assyria at this point.
No, Egypt was relatively weak during much of this period, often internally divided or dealing with its own issues. Pharaohs like Osorkon II or Takelov II couldn't project power effectively into the Levant. So, unlike in earlier or later periods, neither Israel nor Judah could really count on Egypt as a reliable ally against the Assyrian juggernaut.
The division also led to conflict between Israel and Judah sometimes, like between King Jehoash of Israel and King Amaziah of Judah.
Yes, that flare-up in the early 8th century around the 790s BC really shows the broken relationship. Amaziah of Judah got a bit puffed up after a victory over Edom and challenged Jehoash of Israel. Jehoash responded with that famous parable of the thistle trying to marry the seer's daughter, basically telling Amaziah not to get too big for his britches. It's in 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 9 and 10.
How did that end?
Not well for Amaziah. He ignored the warning, they fought, Judah was defeated, and Jehoash actually captured Amaziah, marched on Jerusalem, broke down part of the city wall, and plundered the temple and the palace. It's a sad episode, detailed in 2 Kings 14, 11 to 14.
Judah did have better times, though, like under King Uzziah later in that century.
Indeed. Uzziah's long reign in Judah, overlapping with Jeroboam II in Israel during the mid-8th century BC, was a period of significant strength, stability, and prosperity for Judah. Both Kings and Chronicles mention his successes, military campaigns, building projects, administrative organization. 2 Chronicles chapter 26 gives a particularly full account. It was something of a renaissance for Judah.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly and talk specifically about the role of prophecy in Israel. How were the true prophets different from, say, diviners in other cultures?
That's a crucial distinction. While surrounding cultures had various kinds of diviners, seers, and oracle givers, often attached to temples or royal courts, the true prophets of Israel, as presented in the Old Testament, were unique. Their authority didn't come from institutions or techniques, but directly from God. They felt compelled to speak Yahweh's word, whether it was popular or not.
So they weren't just predicting the future.
No, prediction was sometimes part of it, but their primary role was proclamation addressing the moral and spiritual state of the nation, calling people back to covenant faithfulness, speaking about justice, righteousness, and God's overarching plan, his kingdom. They spoke for God to their present situation.
And the books we have, the canonical prophets, they start appearing after the time of Elijah and Elisha.
Generally, yes. The tradition distinguishes between the earlier, mostly non-writing prophets like Elijah and Elisha, whose stories are embedded in the historical books, and the later writing prophets, whose messages were recorded in the books named after them, starting with figures like Amos and Hosea in the 8th century, down to Malachi in the post-exilic period. Why these specific prophetic writings were preserved and collected is, from a faith perspective, attributed to divine guidance.
Amos is one of those early writing prophets. He prophesied during that prosperous time under Jeroboam II in Israel, but he had a harsh message.
Very harsh. Amos was actually from Judah, but prophesied in the northern kingdom during its peak of prosperity under Jeroboam II, likely mid-8th century BC. He absolutely condemned the rampant social injustice, the oppression of the poor, and the hypocrisy of their religious observance going through the motions of worship while ignoring God's requirements for justice and mercy.
Did he only speak to Israel?
No, he delivered oracles against several surrounding nations first, including Tyre, interestingly. He condemns Tyre in Amos chapter 1, verses 9 and 10 for not remembering the covenant of brotherhood, possibly a reference back to that old treaty between David Solomon and Hiram. He also prophesied against Edom in Amos 1, 11-12 for relentless hostility, echoing themes in Obadiah. But his main focus was Israel's sin. Yet even Amos ends with a promise of future restoration in chapter 9, verse 11.
Now, Jonah, who also prophesied during Jeroboam II's reign, seems quite different. He actually had a positive message for the king.
Yes, it's an interesting contrast. Jonah, son of Amittai, who the book of Jonah is about, is also mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25. There, it says he prophesied to Jeroboam II about Israel recovering some lost territory, specifically mentioning Damascus and Hamath. This seems to have been a word of encouragement or divine sanction for Jeroboam's military successes, probably around 773 BC. That historical anchor in 2 Kings supports the view that Jonah was a real historical figure.
And Hosea. His ministry spanned a really long time.
Hosea did have a very long ministry, probably starting in the latter years of Jeroboam II in Israel and continuing through the reigns of several kings in Judah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, as his book's introduction in Hosea 1, verse 1 states. He primarily addressed the northern kingdom, using his own tragic marriage as a metaphor for God's relationship with unfaithful Israel. But the time frame suggests he might have shifted his focus more towards Judah as the northern kingdom declined and eventually fell.
Jumping ahead a bit to Judah in the late 7th century, King Josiah's reign saw a major reformation sparked by finding the Book of the Law.
That was a pivotal moment. During renovations in the temple around 622 BC, the high priest Hilkiah found a scroll, widely believed to be a form of Deuteronomy. When it was read to King Josiah, he was deeply convicted and launched a sweeping religious reform. This is detailed in 2 Kings chapters 22 and 23, and also in 2 Chronicles 34. He renewed the covenant publicly, pledging obedience himself and leading the people to do the same, as 2 Kings 23 verses 1-3 describes.
And he held a massive Passover celebration.
Yes, 2 Chronicles chapter 35 verses 1-19 describes an enormous Passover observance, perhaps the grandest since the time of Samuel, all done according to the instructions found in that scroll. It was a major effort to restore proper Yahwistic worship.
Around that same general time, the prophet Nahum was active, focusing on Assyria.
Nahum's prophecy is almost entirely focused on the impending destruction of Nineveh, the capital of the mighty Assyrian Empire. He likely prophesied sometime in the latter part of Ashurbanipal's reign, maybe between 640 and 627 BC. He mentions the fall of Thebes in Egypt, which happened in 663 BC, as a past event, giving us a reference point. His message is one of doom for Assyria, celebrating God's justice against the oppressor.
Then Jeremiah comes on the scene during Judah's final, desperate years leading up to the Babylonian exile.
Jeremiah had arguably the toughest prophetic job, ministering during the reigns of Judah's last kings, including Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah in the early 6th century BC. He relentlessly warned of impending judgment from Babylon if they didn't repent and submit. Even when King Jehoiakim initially submitted to Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah insisted Jerusalem would still fall because of their deep-seated sin, as we see in Jeremiah chapter 36.
And Jehoiakim didn't take kindly to that message.
Not at all. Famously, when Jeremiah's scroll containing these prophecies was read to him, Jehoiakim took a knife, cut it up piece by piece, and threw it into the fire. Jeremiah's response, recorded in Jeremiah 36, verse 30, was an even harsher prophecy specifically against the king. His ministry was marked by opposition and suffering.
So the exile happens. Babylon conquers Judah, destroys Jerusalem in 586 BC. Seems like the end. But then comes Cyrus the Great of Persia. This cycle of destruction and rebuilding, it really makes you think about resilience, doesn't it? And how communities reform themselves after trauma.
It really does. The Babylonian conquest, detailed in 2 Kings 24 and 25, was devastating. But then, yes, the geopolitical landscape shifts again. Cyrus the Great defeats the Babylonians, and in 539 BC, he issues his famous decree, documented on the Cyrus cylinder and also reflected in the Book of Ezra. His policy was surprisingly tolerant, allowing exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The specific decree for the Jews came in 538 BC.
And the temple rebuilding eventually got done.
It did, though not without challenges and delays. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, and Joshua the high priest, the Second Temple was finally completed and dedicated in 516 BC during the reign of the Persian king Darius I. That date, 516 BC, significantly marks roughly 70 years since the temple's destruction in 586 BC, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy in a cultic sense, as Ezra chapter 6, verse 15 notes. They celebrated with a dedication service and a Passover, consciously echoing the Exodus.
And later, Ezra and Nehemiah lead further efforts to rebuild the community itself.
Exactly. The physical temple was rebuilt, but the community needed spiritual and social rebuilding too. Ezra, the priest and scribe expert in the law of Moses, arrived in Jerusalem in 458 BC during the reign of Artaxerxes I. Ezra chapter 7, verse 8 gives the date. He came with another group of returnees and royal authorization, detailed in Ezra 7, 12-26, to teach and enforce the Torah, reestablishing Jewish life according to God's law.
And Nehemiah focused on the walls.
Nehemiah, who was a high-ranking Jewish official in the Persian court, heard about the dilapidated state of Jerusalem's walls and got permission from Artaxerxes to return and rebuild them. He arrived in 444 BC, according to Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. Despite intense opposition from local rivals, described vividly in Nehemiah chapter 4, he rallied the people and they rebuilt the walls in an astonishing 52 days, as Nehemiah 6:15 tells us. He also worked with Ezra on religious and social reforms, including that great public reading of the law described in Nehemiah chapter 8.
So under Persian rule, the Jewish community had a measure of security to reestablish itself.
Yes, the Persian Empire, for all its vastness, provided a relatively stable framework for the next couple of centuries, until Alexander the Great arrived around 330 BC. Darius I, who reigned when the temple was finished, was generally considered an effective and relatively benign ruler. He organized the empire, built roads like the Royal Road, established a postal system, things that facilitated communication and administration, creating a secure environment for the Judean community to slowly rebuild.
And the story of Esther fits into this Persian period too.
It does. The Book of Esther is set during the reign of Xerxes I, who succeeded Darius. Xerxes is the king called Ahasuerus in the book. That story, taking place in the Persian capital Susa, is a powerful narrative about God's hidden providence, protecting the Jewish people who were still living dispersed throughout the empire, even when his name isn't explicitly mentioned in the book.
Wow, that's quite a sweep of history. It really drives home how the Old Testament itself is interpreting these events through a specific theological lens, mainly the covenant.
Absolutely. As you trace the narrative, you see this constant interplay, historical events happening, the biblical writers recording and interpreting those events, often through the lens of covenant faithfulness or unfaithfulness, prophetic commentary weighing in, and archaeological or external texts, sometimes providing context or corroboration, sometimes raising more questions. It's complex.
It definitely highlights that you need both the text and the artifacts, but even then, understanding the past involves interpretation. There's always going to be some ambiguity.
Precisely. The texts give voice and meaning to the mute artifacts, but even the texts require careful reading and interpretation. Acknowledging the limits of our knowledge is part of the process.
But the overall story, from covenant to monarchy, division, the trauma of exile, and then the hope of return and rebuilding it, speaks volumes about faith and failure and resilience and the idea of God's enduring promises.
It really does. It's a narrative filled with profound insights into the human condition and the nature of God as portrayed within this tradition.
Well, hopefully this deep dive has sparked some of those aha moments for listeners and given a clearer picture of the main storylines and the historical backdrop. But I'm sure it also raises questions. What stands out most to you listening back over this? What are you still pondering? Because this is really just scratching the surface, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. There's so much more detail and nuance in every period we've touched on. But maybe one thing to reflect on is that cyclical pattern we kept seeing: faithfulness leading to blessing and security, followed by complacency or disobedience, leading to hardship and judgment, then repentance and restoration. It makes you wonder, what relevance might that pattern have, not just for understanding ancient Israel, but maybe for how we look at history more broadly, or even our own communities and lives today?